These days, when big corporations sweep through communities like locusts, devouring family farms and small towns for profit, I'm reminded of a story my grandmother told me. It's about what happens when ordinary folks refuse to back down, when neighbors choose to stand together against impossible odds. This tale proves that sometimes the meekest among us possess the fiercest courage. Grace felt the stagecoach wheels lock against Texas dust. Through the settling cloud, she spotted him, hat clutched in weathered hands, shoulders bent inward like a man expecting disappointment. "You'd be Grace Miller." "I reckon I am." She stepped down. Carpetbag gripped tight. The ranch house behind him sagged at one corner, its porch rail hanging loose as a broken promise. Two pale faces appeared at a window, then vanished quick as startled rabbits. "My girls," Silas said, voice catching on the words. "They're mighty particular about strangers." Grace followed his gaze to fresh-turned earth beneath a spreading oak tree, a wooden cross, recent. "Your wife, Margaret. Dust storm took her come spring." His hands trembled as he gestured toward the house. "Haven't been the same since. None of us." Grace noticed the silence first, no children's laughter, no woman's humming from the kitchen, just wind through broken fence slats and the lonesome creak of a door hanging askew. Lord have mercy. What had she walked into? Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from now. Let's get back to the story. Grace's thin mattress creaked with every breath. Through pine walls, she heard boots crossing floorboards back and forth, back and forth. A chair scraped against wood. Glass clinked like a man nursing his sorrows. Silas wasn't sleeping either. Dawn light crept through her single window. The boots stopped moving. A door groaned on rusted hinges. Then silence stretched like a held breath. Grace pulled on her woolen dress, fingers working familiar bone buttons. The kitchen held yesterday's cold coffee, bitter as medicine in a dented tin pot. Cornbread sat hard as limestone on the table beside congealed bacon grease that smelled of defeat. "Papa's already gone to the barn." Grace turned. A girl stood in the doorway, maybe 8 years old, brown hair hanging in limp braids. Her calico dress, once blue with tiny flowers, had faded to the color of old dishwater. "You're Mary." "Yes'm." The child's curtsy belonged in a parlor, not a kitchen where flies buzzed over unwashed plates. "Sarah's still sleeping. She cries at night sometimes." Grace's chest tightened like a drawn bowstring. "What about you, honey?" Mary's chin lifted. "I don't cry. I take care of things." The girl moved to the cook stove, standing on a wooden crate to reach the coffee pot. Her movements held the careful precision of someone who'd burned herself learning. "I can do that," Grace offered. "I know how." Mary's voice carried an edge sharp as winter wind. "I've been doing it since—" She bit off the words. "Since Margaret died." Grace heard it in the silence that followed. A smaller voice drifted from the back room. "Mary, Mary, where are you?" "Coming." "Sarah." Mary climbed down from the crate, but Grace touched her arm gentle-like. "Let me." Mary's muscles went rigid under Grace's touch. "She doesn't cotton to strangers." "I understand." Grace released her grip. "But maybe you could show me where she keeps her things. Her brush, her Sunday dress." Mary studied Grace's face like she was reading words in a foreign tongue. Finally, she nodded toward the hallway. Grace followed her past a closed door, Silas's room. She reckoned to a smaller chamber where golden light fell across 2 narrow beds. On the floor between them sat a tiny figure in a white nightgown, dark hair tangled around her shoulders. In her lap lay torn fabric and a hopeless snarl of thread. Sarah looked up with Margaret's eyes, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. The child wasn't playing with the sewing. She was trying to fix her only dress. Grace knelt beside Sarah, close enough to smell the child's unwashed hair and see dried tears on her cheeks like salt tracks. The torn dress, once white cotton with tiny pink roses, hung in two pieces connected by a few stubborn threads. "May I look?" Sarah's fingers tightened on the fabric, but she didn't pull away. Grace examined the tear running from shoulder to waist, clean rip, probably caught on a nail or fence wire. "I can fix this good as new." Grace's voice came out steadier than she felt. "But first, let's get you into something else." Mary appeared with a faded green dress, too big for Sarah's thin frame. Together, they worked Sarah's arms through sleeves that hung past her wrists like empty flour sacks. "There's thread in Mama's basket," Mary whispered, pointing to the mantelpiece. Grace found the sewing basket where dust motes danced in morning light. Inside, spools of thread still bright as jewels, steel needles sharp as thorns, and a silver thimble worn smooth by familiar fingers. Margaret's hands had held these same tools, guided thread through fabric with the same careful stitches. Grace carried the basket to the kitchen table. Sarah followed, bare feet silent on pine boards. The child climbed onto a chair and watched Grace thread a needle, small eyes tracking each movement like she was memorizing every detail. "You know how to sew," Mary observed from the doorway. "My mama taught me back in Kansas." Grace began tiny stitches along the tear, pulling torn edges together. "Said a woman who couldn't mend wasn't much use to anybody. Mama knew how to." Sarah's voice barely reached across the table. "She was making me a new dress for Christmas." Grace's needle paused. Christmas was 8 months away. Margaret would never finish that dress. What color was it going to be? "Blue," Sarah breathed. "Blue like Mama's best Sunday dress." Grace resumed stitching. Outside, an axe bit into wood-steady rhythm of Silas splitting kindling for the cook stove. Inside, dust particles swirled through window light, and the coffee pot ticked as it cooled on the cast-iron range. When Grace finished the repair, she held up the dress. The tear had disappeared, leaving only faint thread lines like old scars that told stories without shame. Sarah reached for the garment, then stopped. "Will it tear again?" "Not if you're careful with it." Grace folded the dress and placed it in Sarah's hands. "But even if it does, I can fix it again." The child's fingers stroked the mended fabric like she was petting a kitten. She nodded once, then slipped down from the chair and disappeared toward the back room. Mary remained in the doorway, studying Grace with eyes too old for her 8 years. "Can you fix other things?" Mary asked. "What kind of things?" Mary pointed to a shelf where a china doll sat slumped against the wall. One porcelain arm hung at an unnatural angle, and stuffing leaked from a hole in its cloth body like cotton snow. "Mama said she'd fix Rose when she got time." Mary's voice carried no emotion, just facts stated plain. But then the dust storm came. Grace lifted the doll carefully. The porcelain arm had broken clean at the shoulder, not impossible to mend. The body would need restuffing, but the cotton ticking was sound. "I reckon I can try." Grace cradled the doll like she would an injured bird. "What happened to her?" "Mary dropped her running from the storm," Sarah said, reappearing in her mended dress. "Mama said accidents happen, but Rose still needs fixing." Grace spent the morning stitching while Mary stayed close, handing her thread and holding fabric taut. When Sarah returned wearing her mended dress, she perched on a wooden crate to watch Grace work magic with needle and thread. By noon, Rose sat upright with both arms working and fresh stuffing filling her body. The pink dress had been washed and pressed, bright again despite its years of love. Mary reached for the doll, then hesitated like she was asking permission. "Go ahead, honey," Grace said. Mary lifted Rose, cradling her against her chest. For the first time since Grace's arrival, the child's face softened into something that remembered how to be young. The kitchen door opened. Silas stepped inside, hat in hand, sawdust clinging to his work shirt. His eyes found Mary holding the repaired doll, then moved to Grace. "Thought I'd make cornbread for supper," Grace said, rising from her chair. "If you have cornmeal—" Silas nodded toward a cabinet. "Mary, show her where things are kept." Grace found cornmeal yellow as summer sunshine, salt white as fresh snow, and a piece of bacon fat for greasing the cast-iron skillet. She mixed batter while Silas washed his hands at the washstand, water splashing into the chipped blue basin like rain after drought. The cornbread baked while Grace prepared beans seasoned with salt pork and molasses. Steam rose from pots, and the kitchen filled with scents that belonged in a home, not just a house where people happened to sleep. When they sat for supper, Silas tasted the cornbread first. He chewed slowly, deliberately, like a man who'd forgotten food could have flavor. "This is fine bread," he said. "Not just good, the first food praised in months." Sarah ate without speaking, but she finished everything on her plate. Mary asked for seconds, something she hadn't done since before the storm. Grace watched them eat and felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen like a knot working free. "You taught school?" Silas asked as Grace cleared plates. 2 years in Topeka." Grace scraped crumbs from the table. "Children aged 6 to 12, mostly. Mary's 8, Sarah's 6. He paused, studying the worn wood of the table. "Neither can read much anymore." "I could teach them," Grace offered. "If you want me to." Silas studied her face like he was measuring lumber for a fence. "Margaret started teaching them their letters. They have her primer somewhere." That evening, after dishes were washed and put away, Grace found the primer on a shelf in the girls' room. The pages were worn soft from handling, and Margaret's handwriting filled the margins gentle reminders about letter shapes and simple words written in a hand that would never write again. Grace settled on Sarah's bed with both girls beside her. She opened the primer to the first page and began reading aloud. "The cat sat on the mat." "Can you say that?" "Sarah." Sarah repeated the words, her small voice gaining strength with each syllable. Mary followed along, finger tracing letters she was beginning to remember. As Grace read, Sarah shifted closer inch by inch, then closer still, until her thin shoulder pressed against Grace's arm like a baby bird seeking warmth. Neither of them moved away. The coal oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on log walls. Outside, night sounds began, crickets singing their ancient songs and the distant howl of something wild. But inside the small room, something fragile was taking root in soil that had seemed too hard for growing. Grace closed the primer. "Tomorrow we'll read more." "Will you tell us a story now?" Mary asked. Grace looked at their upturned faces, pale in the lamplight, and realized she was being tested, not just tonight, but every moment since her arrival. They were measuring her words, her actions, her willingness to stay when staying got difficult. She began a story about a brave princess who lived in a castle made of books. As she spoke, both girls leaned against her, Mary on one side, Sarah on the other, their small bodies warm and trusting. For the first time in months, the house held something warmer than mere survival. But as Grace continued the story, movement outside caught her eye. Through the window, torchlight flickered in the distance, weaving between fence posts like a drunken firefly. Someone was coming toward the house in the dark, and they weren't bothering to hide their approach. Grace set the primer aside, her pulse hammering against her throat like a woodpecker on oak. The torchlight bobbed closer, weaving between fence posts and casting wild shadows across the yard. Girls, stay put. She moved to the window, pressing her face against cool glass that fogged with her breath. A familiar voice called out from the darkness. "Silas, you awake in there? Neighbor." Grace's shoulders dropped like stones falling into a well. Not strangers, not danger. "It's Jake Henderson," Mary whispered from the bed. "Papa's friend from down the valley." Bootsteps crossed the porch, followed by Silas's voice. "Coffee's cold, but come in anyway, Jake." Grace tucked both girls under their quilts, kissing foreheads that smelled of soap and childhood innocence. "Sleep now, young ones. Morning comes early on a working ranch." Yet in the kitchen, she found Silas pouring coffee for a weather-beaten man with gray whiskers and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Jake Henderson tipped his hat when he saw her. "Ma'am, heard Silas had company." "Grace Miller," she said, wiping her hands on her apron that still held the scent of cornbread baking. "Jake's got the spread 2 miles south," Silas explained, steam rising from his coffee cup like morning mist. "Known him since we were boys running wild through these parts." Jake accepted a tin cup of reheated coffee that had gone bitter as chicory. "Wife sent me to invite you folks for Sunday dinner. Been meaning to get over here, but lambing season kept us busier than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Grace watched Silas's face close up tight as a coffin lid. He hadn't left the ranch since Margaret's funeral, and Jake had probably come to coax him back into the world of the living. "Much obliged for the thought," Silas muttered into his coffee. "Bring Grace along, too," Jake continued, stirring his coffee with a bent spoon. "Emma's eager to meet her. Says it's high time this place had a woman's touch again." After Jake left, Grace found herself alone with Silas in the lamplight. He stared into his coffee like it held answers to questions he couldn't voice aloud. "The girls need to see other children," Grace said quietly, her words careful as stepping stones across a creek. "Mary, especially." Silas nodded without looking up, coffee steam wreathing his face like smoke. "Sunday, then." The next morning, Grace woke before dawn and found the kitchen already warm with banked coals. Silas had started the fire, left fresh eggs in a bowl beside the washstand, and disappeared again into his endless work like a ghost who couldn't rest. Grace fried eggs and cornmeal mush in bacon grease that popped and sizzled in the cast-iron skillet. She called the girls when everything was ready, their small feet padding across pine floors like mice in the walls. They ate quickly. Then Grace surveyed the house with new eyes that saw every speck of dust and cobweb. Dust layered every surface thick as felt blankets. Cobwebs drooped from ceiling corners like Spanish moss. Windows wore grime like cataracts, blocking precious sunlight from rooms that needed brightening. "Today we clean house," she announced. Rolling up her sleeves, Mary's face crumpled like wet paper. "The whole place, room by room, like eating a watermelon one bite at a time." Grace filled buckets with hot water that steamed in the cool morning air, adding lye soap that bit at her nostrils. She gave Mary a rag for low surfaces, showed Sarah how to dust wooden furniture without knocking over precious things that held memories. They worked steadily through the morning, Grace humming work songs her mother had taught her back in Kansas, melodies that made labor lighter and time pass sweeter. "What's that song about?" Sarah asked, pausing in her dusting to cock her head like a curious sparrow. "Sweet Betsy from Pike, about a woman who traveled west to find a new life for herself." "Like you did," Grace wrung out her rag, considering the question with the weight it deserved. "I reckon so, honey." They cleaned until the sun stood high overhead, then stopped for bread and butter that filled their bellies and gave strength for afternoon work. The parlor already looked different, brighter, more welcoming. Afternoon light streamed through clean windows like liquid gold, revealing faded roses in the wallpaper Grace hadn't noticed before. "Mama chose that paper," Mary said, following Grace's gaze. "Said roses would make the room feel happy, even on gray days." Grace studied the delicate pattern, noting quality workmanship and careful application. Margaret had possessed good taste and money enough for pretty things. This house had known prosperity once, before dust storms and death stole the light from its windows. "She was right as rain," Grace said. "Roses do make a room happier." After cleaning, Grace found Margaret's sewing basket again and pulled out embroidery floss, bright skeins of yellow, red, and blue that caught afternoon light like captured rainbows. She selected a plain dish towel from the kitchen drawer, white cotton that would show off colorful stitching. "Want to learn something beautiful?" she asked Mary. They sat together at the kitchen table where sunlight puddled warm on scrubbed wood. Grace demonstrated simple stitches: chain stitch for flower stems, lazy daisy for petals, French knots for flower centers that looked like tiny pearls. Mary's first attempts wobbled like a newborn colt learning to walk. Her stitches wandered across the fabric like lost sheep, some too tight, others loose enough to catch thumbs, but she kept at it, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in fierce concentration. Sarah watched from her perch on the wooden crate, chin resting on folded arms like she was watching a magic show. "I want to try too," she said finally. "Your fingers are still small for needlework," Grace said, gentle-like. "But you can help choose colors for the flowers." Sarah selected bright yellow for sunflower petals, green for leaves that would dance in imaginary breezes. As Mary stitched, Sarah called out encouragement. "That one's mighty pretty. Make another just like it." When the first flower took shape, crooked but recognizable, Mary held up the towel with pride shining in her dark eyes like polished stones. "Mama would fancy this," she said. "She surely would," Grace agreed. "She'd be proud of how well you're learning." Supper preparation became a lesson too. Grace showed Mary how to check eggs for cracks before breaking them into the bowl, how to test oil temperature by dropping in a pinch of flour and watching it dance. Sarah learned to set the table proper, like forks on the left, knives on the right, plates centered just so. "Good cooks clean as they go," Grace explained, washing bowls immediately instead of letting them pile up like dirty thoughts. "Saves work later and keeps the kitchen pleasant for everyone." When Silas returned from the fields, dirt under his fingernails and sweat staining his shirt, he stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. The room smelled like heaven on earth: fried chicken golden as autumn leaves, cream gravy white as fresh snow, and biscuits tall enough to make a preacher weep with joy. "Smells like—" He paused, searching for words that had been buried under months of grief. "Like home," Grace suggested, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, like home used to smell." During supper, Sarah chattered about the day's adventures like a mockingbird that had learned too many songs. Mary displayed her embroidered flower, explaining each stitch type with the precision of a schoolteacher. Silas listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that showed he was truly hearing every word. "Grace taught us a song too," Mary said, cutting her chicken into dainty bites. "About Sweet Betsy from Pike." "Sing it," Silas said, his voice carrying genuine interest instead of polite obligation. Mary's voice started thin as creek water, but gained strength as Sarah joined in with her piping soprano. "Oh, do you remember Sweet Betsy from Pike, who crossed the wide prairies with her lover Ike, with 2 yoke of cattle and 1 spotted hog, a tall Shanghai rooster and 1 yellow dog?" Their voices filled the kitchen with music it hadn't heard since Margaret's laughter died with the dust storm. Grace watched Silas's face soften like butter in warm sunshine, saw him tap his thumb against his coffee cup in time with their singing. When they finished the verse, he clapped his hands slow and deliberate, each clap echoing off log walls like applause in a church. "Your mama loved that song," he said, voice thick as molasses. "Used to sing it while she kneaded bread." After dishes were washed and put away, they moved to the parlor, where clean windows let in the last golden light of day. Grace lit the coal oil lamp while Silas settled into his chair the first time he'd sat anywhere but the kitchen since her arrival. Mary brought her embroidery, working carefully by lamplight that danced across her serious young face. Sarah curled up on the braided rug with Rose the mended doll, whispering secrets that only china ears could hear. Grace picked up a shirt of Silas's that needed mending a rip along the shoulder seam where it had caught on barbed wire sharp enough to cut dreams. She stitched with neat, even strokes, reinforcing weak spots with tiny patches cut from fabric scraps that Margaret had saved for just such purposes. As she worked, she became aware of Silas watching her hands move with the same practiced skill his wife had possessed. "You mend like Margaret did," he said quietly, words falling into the lamplit room like stones in still water. "Strong stitches that'll hold through hard use." "Waste not, want not," Grace replied, echoing her mother's voice from across the years. "Good fabric deserves careful tending." Silence settled over them, not the heavy quiet of grief, but something lighter that held the promise of peace. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on rose-papered walls that had remembered how to be beautiful. Outside, night sounds began their ancient chorus crickets singing love songs, owl calls echoing across empty fields, wind through mesquite branches that whispered secrets older than memory. Grace tied off her thread and examined the mended shirt. The repair was nearly invisible, strong enough to withstand another year of honest labor. "There," she said, folding the shirt neat as Sunday prayers. "Good as new." When she looked up, she found Mary watching her with unusual intensity, needle poised above her embroidery like a butterfly about to land. "Grace," Mary said, voice careful as someone testing thin ice, "will you teach me to make pie?" The question hung in warm air like incense, carrying weight far beyond its simple words. Teaching Mary to make pie meant believing in tomorrow, in next week, in a future where they would all still be together around this kitchen table. Grace's throat tightened like a drawstring purse. "Apple pie. Mama's favorite. She always said she'd teach me when I got big enough to reach the rolling pin proper." Grace looked at Silas, searching his weathered face for permission or prohibition. He nodded once, barely visible, but unmistakably clear. "Tomorrow, then," Grace promised. Words that felt like taking communion. "We'll make the finest apple pie this side of creation." Mary smiled, the first real smile Grace had seen from her. Not forced politeness or practiced courtesy, but genuine pleasure that transformed her serious face into something that remembered childhood joy. Later, as Grace tucked the girls into bed with stories and kisses that tasted of hope, Sarah grabbed her hand with both small fists. "Grace, will you stay with us always and forever?" The question pierced Grace's heart like a well-aimed arrow. Always and forever were words she'd learned not to trust. Promises broken too often by death and circumstance beyond anyone's control. "I'm going to stay as long as you need me," she said carefully, measuring each word like flour for baking. "I need you always and forever," Sarah whispered. Grace kissed the child's forehead, tasting salt from tears she hadn't known were falling. "Then we'll take it one day at a time, like the good Lord intended." The next morning dawned crisp as fresh apples, with autumn air that carried promises of harvest time and winter preparations. Grace woke to the sound of Silas chopping wood behind the house-steady rhythm that spoke of purpose and provision for cold months ahead. She dressed quickly and found the kitchen warm with banked fire, coffee ready in the pot, fresh eggs waiting in their blue bowl, like small promises of abundance, while breakfast cooked eggs fried in butter that sputtered like tiny firecrackers, bacon crisp as autumn leaves. Grace planned the day's lessons. Pie crust required precise technique and patient hands. Too much water made it tough as leather. Too little made it crumble like old dreams. After breakfast, Grace sent Mary to the root cellar for apples while she gathered ingredients on the kitchen table like a general preparing for battle flour white as fresh snow. Lard rendered from last year's hogs, salt to brighten flavors, sugar to sweeten bitter memories, cinnamon bark that smelled of Christmas mornings. Mary returned with an apron full of apples, red and gold varieties that had spent the summer growing fat and sweet under Texas sunshine. Grace selected the best ones, showing Mary how to test for firmness and check for spots that spoke of worms or early rot. "First, we make the crust," Grace said, measuring flour into Margaret's blue crockery bowl that felt warm under her hands. "Pie crust is like building a fence, needs to be strong enough to hold everything together, but tender enough to cut with a fork." Mary watched with the intensity of a preacher studying scripture as Grace cut lard into flour, working the mixture with fingertips that remembered their mother's lessons. She added cold water drop by careful drop, mixing with a fork until the dough just held together like a family learning to trust again. "Your turn, honey," Grace said, dusting the table with flour that puffed up like tiny clouds. Mary took the rolling pin in both hands, pressing down with all her 8-year-old strength. The dough squashed flat and stuck to the wood like wet clay. "Gentle now," Grace said, placing her work-worn hands over Mary's small ones. "Let the weight of the pin do the work. Roll from the center outward, like ripples on a pond after you drop a stone. Together." They coaxed the dough into a rough circle that would never win prizes at a county fair, but held love enough to feed a family's soul. Mary's face concentrated with the intensity of a doctor performing surgery, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth. The bottom crust settled into the pie tin with only minor tears, which Grace showed Mary how to patch with scraps of dough and gentle fingers. They peeled apples together, Grace's knife moving in long spirals that fell like yellow ribbons, while Mary's attempts produced chunks of varying sizes that would taste just as sweet. "Doesn't matter a whit if they're not perfect," Grace assured her, catching apple peels before they hit the floor. "Apples taste the same whether they're fancy or plain, and the good Lord loves honest effort more than perfect appearance." They tossed apple slices with sugar, flour, and cinnamon until each piece gleamed with sweet coating that promised comfort on cold winter nights. The mixture filled the pie shell to the brim. Then Grace helped Mary roll out the top crust with hands that shook only slightly from excitement. "Now for the pretty part," Grace said, trimming excess dough and crimping edges with fork tines that left patterns like tiny railroad tracks. She cut decorative vents in the top crust, a simple flower pattern that would let steam escape while filling the kitchen with the scent of paradise. Into the oven went their creation, and Grace wound the timer for 1 hour that would pass like a prayer meeting, slow but worth the waiting. The kitchen filled with the scent of baking apples and cinnamon, a smell that spoke of harvest abundance and family love made manifest. While they waited, Grace taught Mary to clean as they worked washing bowls immediately instead of letting them pile up like accusations, wiping spills before they set into permanent stains, keeping the workspace organized for the next cook who would follow in their footsteps. "Good cooks clean as they go," Grace explained, scrubbing flour from the rolling pin. "Saves work later and keeps the kitchen pleasant for everyone who shares the space." When the timer rang like church bells calling the faithful to worship, Grace pulled their masterpiece from the oven with potholders that had seen better days. The crust gleamed golden brown as autumn wheat. The vents bubbled with fragrant juices that promised perfection, and the whole pie looked like something angels might serve at heaven's table. Mary stared at their achievement with wonder bright as Christmas morning. "We made that truly. You made that, honey child. I just helped with the tricky parts." Sarah appeared in the doorway like a moth drawn to flame, lured by the incredible smell that could wake the dead and make them grateful for resurrection. "Is it ready for eating?" "Has to cool first," Grace said, setting the pie on the windowsill where late afternoon light turned the crust to pure gold. "But tonight after supper, we'll cut the first slice and see if it tastes as good as it smells." That evening, when Silas came in from the fields with dirt under his fingernails and honest sweat staining his work shirt, he stopped dead in the kitchen doorway like a man witnessing a miracle. The pie sat cooling on the windowsill, picture perfect in the golden light of sunset streaming through windows that sparkled clean as fresh spring water. Mary bounced on her toes beside him, pride radiating from her small body like heat from a cook stove. "I made it. Grace helped with the hard parts, but I did most of the work myself." Silas approached the pie like a man approaching something sacred, his eyes taking in every detail, the perfectly crimped edges, the delicate flower vents, the way late sunlight turned the crust to something that belonged in a painting. "Margaret always said she'd teach you when you got big enough," he whispered, voice thick as honey in winter. "She would have done better than me," Mary said with 8-year-old honesty. "But Grace says practice makes perfect, and the good Lord loves trying more than succeeding." During supper, pot roast tender enough to cut with a fork, potatoes mashed smooth as silk, green beans seasoned with bacon that made everything taste like celebration. Anticipation filled the air thick as cream. Sarah wiggled in her chair like she had ants in her bloomers, asking every few minutes if the pie was cool enough for eating yet. Mary described every step of the baking process in exhaustive detail, pausing only to take bites of roast that she chewed with mechanical precision, her mind clearly on more important matters than mere sustenance. Finally, as full darkness settled outside like a comfortable quilt, Grace rose to cut the pie. The knife slid through crust with barely a whisper, revealing layers of tender apples swimming in cinnamon-scented juices that looked like liquid sunshine. She served Silas first, as befitted the head of household, then Mary as the chief baker, then Sarah because youngest children deserved special consideration, finally taking a small slice for herself. They ate in reverent silence, each bite releasing flavors that spoke of harvest time and holiday mornings yet to come. When Silas finished his slice, he sat back in his chair and looked directly at Mary with eyes that held more pride than a father had any right to feel. "Best pie I ever tasted," he said solemnly, words that carried the weight of absolute truth. "Better than any served at church socials or county fairs." Mary's face lit up like sunrise breaking over the eastern hills. She clapped her hands once, a spontaneous burst of pure joy, then caught herself and pressed both palms against her mouth as if surprised by her own happiness. But joy, once escaped, couldn't be stuffed back into silence. It filled the kitchen with something warmer than lamplight, sweeter than apple pie, more precious than gold dust. Grace watched this small family rediscovering pleasure in simple things, and felt her own heart expand to dangerous proportions. She was beginning to love these people, truly love them, not just care for their welfare or feel responsible for their happiness. Later, as she cleaned the last pie plate with water that had gone lukewarm, Silas appeared beside her with a dish towel worn soft by years of faithful service. "I'll dry," he offered, rolling up his sleeves. They worked together in comfortable quiet that spoke of partnership rather than obligation, hands occasionally brushing as they passed dishes back and forth. The simple domestic rhythm felt natural as breathing, like they'd been doing this dance for years instead of mere days. "Grace," Silas said as they finished, hanging the dish towel on its wooden peg. "Thank you kindly. 2 words that carried the weight of apple pies and mended dolls, of clean windows and children's laughter restored to a house that had forgotten how to hold joy. 2 words that meant you're giving us back our lives, one small kindness at a time. "Thank you for letting me try," she replied. Words that meant I'm grateful you trusted a stranger with your heart's most precious treasures. But as Grace prepared for bed that night, brushing her hair by lamplight and reflecting on the day's small victories, she heard something outside that made her blood run cold as Winter Creek water. Horses approaching in the darkness. Multiple riders moving fast, their hoofbeats drumming against hard earth like war drums calling warriors to battle. And they weren't slowing down as they neared the house. Grace slipped from her bed, bare feet silent on pine boards that creaked like old bones settling. Through her window, moonlight revealed 3 riders approaching through silver-edged darkness, their horses' breath visible in the chill autumn air. Her heart hammered against her ribs until she recognized the led horse, a spotted mare that belonged to Dr. Wilson from town. The riders reined up at the fence gate, and Grace pressed her ear against cool glass. "Silas, you there? Neighbor, got word the Henderson baby's coming hard. Emma's asking for Grace special-like." Grace's breath fogged the window as relief flooded her chest like warm molasses. Not danger, just neighbors needing help in the way frontier folks always had. One family reaching out to another when trouble came calling. She heard Silas's bedroom door creak open, bare feet hitting floorboards like hail on a tin roof. "Grace," his voice carried through thin walls. "I heard," she called back, already reaching for her wool dress. "I'll saddle up quick as I can. Take the bay mare. She's steadiest in the dark, and these roads ain't fit for a greenhorn at night." Grace dressed by lamplight, fingers working familiar bone buttons while her mind shifted to birthing knowledge learned from her mother back in Kansas. Clean cloths, boiling water, steady hands, and calm voice tools, every frontier woman needed when life came calling in the middle of the night. The ride to Henderson's place passed in a blur of moonlight and horse breath steaming white in cold air. Grace gripped the saddle horn while the bay mare picked her way along rutted roads that could break a horse's leg or a rider's neck without warning. Emma Henderson's labor lasted through the long night. Grace held towels, boiled water on the kitchen range, and spoke soothing words while Dr. Wilson worked with gentle hands that had brought dozens of babies safely into this hard world. When dawn finally broke like a blessing over the eastern hills, a healthy baby boy announced his arrival with lungs that could wake the dead and make them grateful for the noise. Grace didn't return to the ranch until mid-morning, exhaustion weighing her shoulders like wet wool. She found Mary and Sarah eating cold cornbread and molasses for breakfast, their faces lighting up like Christmas morning when she walked through the door. "Where were you?" Sarah asked, climbing onto Grace's lap despite her traveling dress that smelled of antiseptic and hard work. "Helping bring a new baby into the world," Grace said, smoothing Sarah's tangled hair that felt like silk against her fingers. "You have a new neighbor, Jake and Emma's son, healthy as a young bull calf?" Mary's eyes grew wide as saucers. "A real live baby, real as sunrise, honey, tiny fingers, tiny toes, and a voice loud enough to rattle window panes 3 counties over." While Grace changed clothes and washed road dust from her face and hands, the girls peppered her with questions about babies and birthing, and whether they might see the new arrival when Emma felt up to visitors. Their chatter filled the kitchen with comfortable noise, a sound Grace was learning to treasure like music from heaven's own choir. "Today we plant herbs," she announced, tying her work apron around her waist. "Weather's perfect for getting seeds in the ground before winter sets in proper." They gathered tools from the barn, a rusted spade with a handle worn smooth by years of honest labor, a hand cultivator with loose tines that needed tightening, and a wooden bucket for hauling water from the well. Grace had ordered herb seeds from a catalog in town, sage for cooking turkey and pork, thyme for seasoning stews, mint for tea to settle stomachs, and lavender for sachets to keep clothes sweet through long winter months. Behind the kitchen, they found a sunny patch protected from prevailing winds by the house wall. The soil looked hard as adobe brick, but Grace showed the girls how to break it up proper. Working compost from the manure pile into earth that crumbled like brown sugar between their fingers. Plants are like folks, Grace explained as they worked, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air. They need good soil, clean water, and room to grow without being crowded or neglected. Mary attacked the dirt with 8-year-old enthusiasm, sending clods flying in all directions like she was fighting a war against stubborn earth. Sarah tried to help, but mostly succeeded in getting soil under her fingernails and mud on her apron that would need scrubbing later. Grace planted seeds in neat rows, showing the girls how to space them proper and cover them with exactly the right depth of soil. Each packet bore detailed instructions printed in tiny type that spoke of care and precision. Plant in full sun. Water regular but don't drown. Harvest when fully established. "How long before we see green shoots?" Mary asked, patting soil over the last mint seed like she was tucking a baby into its cradle. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather stays cold. Plants have their own schedule, can't hurry them along any more than you can hurry sunrise or sunset. As they worked, Grace found herself talking about her childhood in Kansas, words spilling out like water from a broken dam. Her mother's kitchen garden that fed the family through lean times when crops failed or prices dropped. Her father's cornfields stretching to the horizon like a golden ocean. The way prairie wind sounded different in summer than winter, gentler when the earth was warm. Sharp as a knife when cold came calling. "Did you have brothers and sisters?" Sarah asked, digging tiny holes with her finger like a squirrel burying nuts for winter. Grace's hand stilled on the seed packet, and her throat tightened like a drawstring purse. She'd known this question would come eventually. Children asked direct questions without understanding the weight they carried. "One brother. Tommy. He was younger than you." "Sarah, just a little thing with yellow hair and blue eyes that sparkled when he laughed." "Where is he now?" The question hung in warm air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Grace had practiced this answer in her mind, but speaking it aloud still felt like swallowing broken glass. "He died when he was 4 years old. Fever took him one winter when the medicine couldn't help and prayers weren't enough." Sarah's small face crumpled with concern that looked too old for her 6 years. "Did it hurt him bad?" "Not at the end, honey. He went to sleep one night and didn't wake up peaceful as a bird settling down for the night." Grace smoothed soil with hands that only trembled slightly. "Sometimes that's how the good Lord calls folks home, quiet, as morning mist rising off a pond." Mary stopped digging, dirt clinging to her small hands. "Like Mama." "No, sweetheart. Your Mama fought hard against that dust storm. The wind and dirt just... Sometimes nature is stronger than we are. No matter how hard we fight, or how much we love someone." They finished planting in thoughtful silence, each lost in memories too large for easy words. Grace marked rows with wooden stakes bearing plant names written in careful script that would guide them through the growing season. By noon, the herb garden lay ready for whatever the coming months might bring, neat rows that spoke of hope and planning for a future that included all of them working together. That afternoon, while the girls napped like tired puppies, Grace found herself alone with Silas for the first time since her arrival. He sat on the front porch mending harness leather, hands working the needle with practiced skill that spoke of years making do and fixing what broke instead of buying new. "Mind if I sit a spell?" Grace gestured to the empty chair beside his Margaret's chair. She realized with a start, "Course not." He didn't look up from his work, but she caught the slight smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Heard you did fine work at Emma's birthing." Doc Wilson said you got steady hands and a calm way about you. Dr. Wilson did the real work. I just held things and stayed out of his way when he needed room to maneuver. Emma asked for you special. That means something in these parts where folks don't trust easy or give praise lightly. Grace settled into the chair that fit her body like it had been waiting for her all its life. The seat was worn smooth by years of use, and afternoon sun warmed her face while a gentle breeze carried the scent of mesquite blossoms and the promise of rain. "Silas," she said carefully, measuring each word like flour for baking. "Tell me about Margaret, the real woman. Not just the saint folks make her out to be." His hands paused on the leather strap. Needle suspended like he was deciding whether to trust her with something precious. For a moment Grace thought he might refuse, might retreat behind that wall of grief that had protected him since his wife's death. Then he smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile she'd seen from him since her arrival. "Margaret laughed like music," he said, resuming his stitching with movements that spoke of muscle memory. Not polite lady laughter that sounds like tinkling bells, but deep belly laughs that started in her toes and worked their way up. She'd throw her head back and let it out like she didn't care who heard or what they thought. Grace could almost hear that laughter echoing from the walls of this house that had known joy before sorrow moved in. She sang while she worked, too. Made up words when she forgot the real ones, which happened more often than she cared to admit. Silas's voice carried warmth instead of pain now, like he was sharing treasures instead of bearing burdens. Drove me half crazy with her songs about washing dishes and hanging laundry and feeding chickens. House got too quiet after she was gone, like someone had blown out all the candles and left us stumbling in the dark. "The girls have her smile," Grace observed, watching clouds gather on the horizon. Margaret's smile, my stubborn streak, and their own special ways of seeing the world. Poor little things didn't stand much chance of being ordinary. He tied off his thread and examined the repaired harness with satisfaction. "What about you? Ever been married before this arrangement?" Grace shook her head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Engaged once, to a banker's son in Topeka who seemed decent enough. But when my parents died in the typhus epidemic and left me with nothing but debts and memories, he decided a woman with no family and no inheritance wasn't worth the risk to his reputation." "His loss and my gain," Silas said simply. Words that warmed Grace more than sunshine ever could. They sat in comfortable silence that spoke of understanding rather than awkwardness, watching afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard like fingers reaching for evening. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace that made flying look easy. In the distance, cattle lowed as they moved toward evening water, their voices carrying across empty fields like prayers for rain. Later that day, Mary came running toward the house, bare feet flying over hard ground. When disaster struck swift as lightning, her foot caught on a broken board that jutted from the barn wall like a wooden knife, and she went down hard on rocky ground that showed no mercy to falling children. Grace heard the scream and reached Mary before the echoes died, dropping to her knees beside the girl who lay clutching her right leg. Blood seeped between small fingers that couldn't stem the flow, and Mary's face had gone white as fresh-washed sheets. "Let me see, honey." Grace gently pulled Mary's hands away, revealing a gash along her shin that went deep enough to show bone. The wound was clean but would need careful tending to heal proper without infection. "Silas," Grace called toward the barn, "bring clean water and that bottle of carbolic acid from the kitchen shelf." While Silas ran for supplies, Grace pressed her apron against the wound to slow the bleeding. Mary's tears had stopped, and she watched Grace work with eyes that held trust instead of fear. "Does it hurt something fierce?" Grace asked, keeping her voice steady as bedrock. "Some," Mary admitted, "but not as bad as I expected. Are you going to make it better? I'm surely going to try. Brave girl. Silas arrived with water that steamed in the cool air and the bottle of antiseptic that would sting worse than sin, but prevent infection from setting in. Grace cleaned the wound with gentle thoroughness, watching Mary's face for signs of fainting. You're doing fine as frog's hair, Grace murmured, dabbing blood away with clean cloth. Hold still just a mite longer. When she poured carbolic acid into the gash, Mary's back arched like a bowstring, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she gripped Grace's free hand and watched the cleaning process with the intensity of someone learning important skills. Grace bandaged the wound with soft linen strips, wrapping carefully to allow healing without cutting off circulation. When she finished, Mary sat up and examined the neat white bandage that covered her injury. "Will it leave a scar?" she asked. "Likely so. Scars tell stories about times we were brave enough to get back up after falling down." That evening brought new traditions to their household rhythm. Grace hauled the copper bathtub from the back porch and set it near the kitchen stove where warmth would keep bath water from chilling too quick, while water heated. She gathered clean towels and a bar of lavender soap she'd brought from Kansas. Saturday night baths had been ritual in her childhood home, a weekly ceremony of cleanliness and family connection that made the next day's worship feel more special. She wanted to give that gift to Mary and Sarah, who deserved prettiness and comfort even on the frontier. The girls took turns in warm water that rose like steam toward heaven, while Grace read aloud from Little Women. Mary went first, scrubbing a week's worth of dirt from elbows and knees while Grace worked soap through her brown hair that shone like polished wood when clean. "Why does Joe cut off her hair in the story?" Mary asked, as Grace rinsed soap suds that smelled like summer flowers. "To help her family when they needed money. Sometimes we sacrifice pretty things for more important things like love and loyalty. Would you cut your hair for us if we needed you to?" Grace paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "If you needed me to, yes. Family comes first, always and forever." Sarah's bath came next, the small child splashing happily while Grace continued reading about the March sisters and their struggles during wartime. Sarah's hair was lighter than Mary's, with natural curl that sprang back despite Grace's attempts to smooth it flat. "You have angel hair," Grace told her, working tangles free with fingers gentle as butterfly wings. "Mama used to say that too," Sarah whispered, voice soft as prayer. After baths came hair braiding, an art Grace had perfected during her teaching years when she'd helped students look presentable for school programs and church socials. She sat behind each girl in turn, working damp hair into neat plaits that would keep while they slept. With Sarah, Grace found herself using the same careful part down the center that she'd noticed in old photographs on the mantelpiece, the same technique Margaret had used. Probably learned from her own mother in an unbroken chain of women caring for daughters. As Grace secured Sarah's braids with ribbon the color of spring flowers, she became aware of Silas watching from the kitchen doorway. His face held an expression she couldn't quite read, not pain, but something deeper and more complex than simple grief. For a moment, Grace's hands stilled on the ribbon, wondering if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary, claimed territory that wasn't hers to claim. But when she looked at Silas again, she saw his chest rise and fall in what looked like relief instead of sorrow. "Mama always did 3 braids on Sundays," Sarah said drowsily, voice thick with approaching sleep. 2 regular ones and 1 fancy one on top that looked like a crown. "I could try that tomorrow," Grace offered, finishing the second braid. "If you show me how it's supposed to look." "I remember," Mary said, bouncing despite her bandaged leg. "The fancy braid goes like this." She demonstrated with her fingers, weaving an intricate pattern through the air that looked more like conducting music than braiding hair. Grace laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine pleasure. "I'll need more instruction than that, honey. Maybe we'll practice on Rose first." so I don't make a mess of your pretty hair." After the girls were tucked into bed with final stories and kisses that tasted of lavender soap and childhood sweetness, Grace found herself once again alone with Silas in the kitchen. She emptied the bathtub bucket by bucket, carrying warm water out to nourish the newly planted herbs that would feed their family through seasons yet to come. When she returned from the final trip, Silas was still sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold as Winter Creek water. "Grace," he said without looking up, voice careful as a man walking on thin ice. "What you did tonight, the baths, the braiding, reading stories to my girls, Margaret used to do all that. Every Saturday night like clockwork." Grace's stomach tightened like a fist. Had she overstepped claimed territory that belonged to a dead woman's memory? "I should have asked first," she said carefully, reaching for her apron strings. "No." Silas finally met her eyes, and what she saw there wasn't anger or resentment, but something that looked like gratitude mixed with wonder. "You should have done exactly what you did. Those girls they need what you're giving them. What I can't give them, no matter how hard I try. You give them plenty. Love, security, a home that's safe from harm. I give them survival," he interrupted, standing to carry his cup to the wash basin. "You're giving them life. There's a difference, and it matters more than I can say." As Grace prepared for bed that night, brushing her hair by lamplight and reflecting on the day's small victories, she felt something settling into place inside her chest, not just affection or responsibility, but the deep roots of belonging. These people were becoming more than her charges. They were becoming her family, chosen not by blood or obligation, but by daily acts of care and trust freely given. But as she blew out her lamp and settled under the quilt that smelled of lavender and home, Grace heard something outside that made her eyes snap open in the darkness. Footsteps on the front porch, slow, deliberate, testing each board like someone who didn't want to be heard. Someone was trying not to wake the household, and whoever it was, they'd been there before. Grace slipped from her bed, bare feet silent on pine boards that creaked like old bones settling. Through her window, moonlight revealed nothing but empty yard and sleeping chickens roosting in their coop. The footsteps had stopped. She pressed her ear against the bedroom door, listening like her life depended on hearing every whisper of sound. Silence stretched like held breath. Then floorboards creaked under weight that tried to move careful-like. Someone was surely on the porch moving toward the front door with purpose that set Grace's nerves on edge. A soft knock echoed through the house. Polite, but urgent. Grace pulled on her wrapper and eased her door open. The hallway lay dark as a cave, but she could see faint lamplight under Silas's door. He was awake too, probably reaching for the rifle that hung above his bed. "Silas, you there? Neighbor," Jake Henderson's voice, strained and tired like he'd been riding hard through the night. Grace heard Silas's door creak open, boots hitting floor with deliberate care. "Jake, it's past midnight, friend. Need to talk, private-like, if you don't mind." Grace retreated to her room, but left the door cracked open just enough to catch voices that carried through thin walls. Jake's words tumbled over each other like water over rocks in a spring flood. "Railroad men came by my place today. 3 of them. All city suits and fancy talk that didn't fool nobody. Said they're surveying for a new line through the valley, running east to west through the best grazing land." Grace's blood chilled like Winter Creek water. Railroad companies didn't ask permission, they took what they wanted and left token payments for the privilege. "Railroad," Silas's voice sharpened like a knife being whetted. "Which company? Texas Pacific. Had papers and everything, territorial approval, federal backing, the whole deal. They're not asking polite like Silas. They're telling folks what's going to happen whether we cotton to it or not." Grace gripped her door frame, knuckles white as fresh bone. Railroad companies had destroyed entire communities back in Kansas, buying out some folks and driving off others who tried to resist their so-called progress. "What did you tell them?" Silas asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd already lost too much. "Told them I'd think on it. But they made it clear thinking wasn't really required." Jake's voice dropped lower, like he was sharing secrets that could get a man hurt. "They mentioned your place specific-like. Said the route needs to pass right through your north pasture where the soil's rich and the grass grows thick." Grace closed her eyes, seeing the north pasture in her mind, rolling grassland where Silas ran his best cattle, where water flowed year-round through meadows that fed his family's future, where Margaret lay buried under the spreading oak tree that had shaded 3 generations of Crawford family. "They can't force honest folks to sell," Silas said. But uncertainty leaked through his words like water through cracked pottery. "Can't they?" Henderson down south tried to refuse their generous offer. Next week his well went dry, his fences got cut during the night, and his prize bull turned up dead as yesterday's news. Week after that, he signed their papers quick as you please. Silence stretched between the men like a rope pulled tight. Grace pressed against her doorframe, hardly daring to breathe. "How long do we have?" Silas finally asked, voice hollow as an empty grain barrel. "Month. Maybe less if we're unlucky. They're moving fast as greased lightning want the route surveyed and approved before winter sets in. Already bought out the Mackenzie spread and the Widow Morrison's place for half what they're worth." Grace heard chairs scrape against floor. Then Jake's footsteps crossing the porch with the tired rhythm of a man carrying bad news to good people. Horse hooves faded into darkness, leaving only the tick of the mantel clock and her own ragged breathing that sounded loud as thunder in the quiet house. She didn't sleep the rest of the night, lying in bed listening to Silas pace the kitchen floor like a caged animal. Morning brought gray skies and the smell of rain building on the western horizon. Grace made breakfast with hands that trembled like aspen leaves, trying to act natural while her mind raced through possibilities, none of which looked promising. Silas appeared hollow-eyed and distracted, picking at his eggs and bacon like a man who'd forgotten food was supposed to nourish the body. The girls noticed his mood immediately. Children always could sense when the grown folks were troubled. "Papa? You feeling poorly?" Mary asked, studying his face with 8-year-old concern. "Just tired, sweetheart. Didn't sleep much is all." Sarah climbed onto his lap without invitation, small hands patting his stubbly cheek with gentle fingers. "I can sing you the sleepy song if you want. Mama used to sing it when you couldn't rest proper." Silas managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe tonight, little bird." Grace caught his eye across the table, seeing her own worry reflected there like images in still water. They needed to talk, but not in front of children who'd already lost one parent to forces beyond anyone's control. The opportunity came that afternoon when the girls went down for their naps. Grace found Silas in the barn, repairing a broken harness with movements that spoke of muscle memory rather than conscious thought. "Tell me about the north pasture," she said without beating around the bush. Silas's hands stilled on the leather, needle suspended like he was deciding how much truth to share. "Best grazing land in 3 counties. Stream runs through it year-round. Never goes dry, even in drought years. Been in my family since homestead days when the government was giving land to anyone fool enough to work it. The cemetery. Margaret's there, sleeping under the oak tree she loved for its shade. My parents, too, and my brother who died of fever when we were boys. Been family land for 20 years of sweat and struggle." Grace absorbed this information like a physical blow. The railroad wanted to run tracks through sacred ground, the resting place of people Silas had loved more than his own life. "Show me the property papers," she said, words that came out steadier than she felt. Silas led her to the house, retrieving a tin box from beneath his bed where it had waited through years of peaceful ownership. Inside, Yellowed documents bore official seals and careful handwriting that spoke of honest government and simpler times. Grace spread the papers on the kitchen table, studying boundaries and legal descriptions with growing unease that settled in her stomach like bad food. "Here's the problem," she said, pointing to a section of faded text that looked harmless as Sunday scripture. "The original homestead grant includes mineral rights and water rights, but it's not clear about transportation easements or railroad access. What does that mean in plain English? It means if the railroad has federal backing like they claim, they might be able to use eminent domain laws, take the land for public good, and pay whatever they think it's worth instead of what it's actually worth." Silas's face went gray as old ashes. How much would they pay for 20 years of my life? Grace had seen railroad acquisitions before, back in Kansas where progress trampled over people like wildfire through dry grass. 50 cents on the dollar if you're lucky and have a good lawyer. 10 cents if you try to fight them without proper legal help. That evening, word spread through the valley like wildfire on a windy day. Neighbors gathered at the Henderson place to discuss the railroad situation, a grim-faced collection of farmers and ranchers who'd built their lives from raw dirt and stubborn hope that good work would be rewarded. Grace accompanied Silas and the girls, her stomach tight with dread that tasted like copper pennies. Emma Henderson greeted them at the door. New baby sleeping in her arms and worry etched deep in her face like lines drawn with a sharp knife. "Glad you came," Emma said, bouncing the baby gentle-like. "We need all the level heads we can get for this discussion." The parlor overflowed with concerned voices that rose and fell like wind through wheat fields. Grace recognized most faces from church services and community gatherings, but tonight, familiar features wore unfamiliar expressions: fear, anger, resignation that spoke of folks who'd been beaten down before. Tom Mackenzie stood near the fireplace, hat clutched in work-worn hands. "Already signed with them," he announced to the room like a man confessing sins. "Got 3 boys to think about. And they made it clear that resistance wasn't healthy for family men who wanted to keep breathing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like stones thrown in still water. If Mackenzie had sold out, others would follow like dominoes falling in a straight line. "What did they offer?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man calculating his own future. $2 an acre for prime land worth 5 on any honest day. Take it or take nothing, those were my choices. And I chose to feed my boys rather than fight windmills. Grace studied the faces around her, reading defeat in slumped shoulders and downcast eyes that had seen too much hardship. These people had fought drought, disease, and economic hardship for decades. But the railroad represented something different: organized power backed by federal authority and unlimited money. "What about legal challenges?" she asked, voice cutting through resigned muttering. "Has anyone consulted a lawyer about property rights and territorial procedures?" Bitter laughter answered her question like crows cawing at dawn. "Nearest lawyers in Austin," said Bill Morgan, whose spread bordered the proposed railroad route. "Railroad probably has him on their payroll anyway, along with half the territorial government." "Not all lawyers work for railroad companies," Grace said, her voice gaining strength like a river fed by spring rains. "There are territorial regulations governing land acquisition that protect honest homesteaders, federal procedures that must be followed to the letter, regardless of who has money and influence." The room fell silent as a tomb. All eyes turned toward her, this newcomer, who dared suggest that organized resistance might be possible against corporate power backed by government authority. "You know something about law?" Jake asked, hope creeping into his voice like sunrise after a long, dark night. "I read everything I can get my hands on. I research problems until I understand them. I ask questions until I get answers that make sense." Grace's voice carried conviction earned through years of teaching school and solving problems that seemed impossible. Railroad companies count on people not knowing their rights. They use intimidation and false deadlines because it's cheaper than paying fair compensation for honest folks' property. Fighting costs money we don't have, Tom Mackenzie said, defeat weighing his words like stones in a sack. Not fighting costs everything we do have, Grace replied, meeting his eyes without flinching. Sometimes you have to risk what you've got to keep what matters most. As the meeting broke up with neighbors departing in worried clusters, Grace found herself walking beside Mrs. Morrison, whose husband had died the previous winter, leaving her alone with a small spread that barely supported one person. "You really think we can fight them?" the older woman asked, voice thin as paper but carrying hope that refused to die. "I think we have to try," Grace said, measuring her words careful-like. Running away isn't always surrender, but giving up without a fight surely is. That night, after the girls were asleep and the house had settled into evening quiet, Grace sat at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, property maps, and borrowed law books from the county seat. Coal oil lamp flames danced across pages dense with legal terminology that would have discouraged most frontier women. Silas watched her work from his chair by the fire, occasionally refilling her coffee cup or adding coal to keep the room warm. The clock ticked toward midnight, but Grace kept reading, making careful notes in the margins of a composition book with handwriting precise as a schoolmarm's. "Find anything useful?" Silas asked around 11 o'clock, voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "Maybe something," Grace replied, not looking up from a page about territorial procedures and federal requirements. Railroad companies have broad eminent domain powers, but they're not unlimited like they want folks to believe. They have to prove public necessity, offer fair compensation, and follow specific territorial procedures that protect homesteaders. And if they don't follow proper procedures, then they're breaking federal law, and even territorial governments can't ignore that for long. Grace looked up from her research, eyes gritty with exhaustion but bright with possibility. Question is whether anyone will enforce those laws against a company with territorial backing and deep pockets. "Long odds against regular folks," Silas observed, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen power trample justice before. "Better than no odds at all," Grace replied, returning to her reading with determination that wouldn't bend. She worked until her eyes burned and the words began to blur together like ink in rainwater, whereas parties of the first part, heretofore designated, in consideration of valuable compensation, but kept pushing through legal language that seemed designed to confuse honest people. A sound outside made her look up from her books. Horse hooves on the hard-packed road, approaching fast through the darkness with urgency that spoke of trouble riding toward their door. "Expecting anyone at this hour?" she asked Silas, who was already reaching for his rifle above the mantelpiece. He shook his head, checking the rifle's load with movements that spoke of frontier caution. "Not unless someone's bringing bad news that couldn't wait for morning light." The rider reined up at their gate, moonlight revealing a single figure on horseback. The man dismounted with practiced ease and approached the house with confident strides that spoke of authority and official business. Grace recognized him immediately, one of the railroad surveyors she'd seen in town that afternoon, watching folks and taking notes like he was cataloging property that already belonged to his company. Clean-shaven face, city clothes that had never seen honest work, leather satchel slung across his shoulder like a badge of corporate authority. "Mr. Crawford," the man called out, voice carrying across the yard with practiced politeness that couldn't hide underlying threat. "Sorry for the late hour, but I have papers requiring your immediate attention and signature." Grace and Silas exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding. Railroad men didn't make social calls after midnight unless they brought serious trouble dressed up as legal necessity. Silas opened the door, rifle visible but not directly threatening. "What kind of papers? Territorial Survey Commission has approved our proposed route. We'll need access to your property starting tomorrow morning for final boundary marking and right-of-way determination." The surveyor produced an official-looking document with red wax seals that gleamed in lamplight. This grants us temporary easement for survey purposes, as required by territorial law. Grace joined Silas in the doorway, reading over his shoulder while her mind raced through legal procedures she'd been studying. The document bore impressive letterhead and authoritative language, but something felt wrong about the timing and circumstances. "Why the sudden hurry?" she asked, voice steady despite her racing heartbeat. "Survey work usually takes weeks or months to complete proper." The surveyor's eyes shifted to her with obvious displeasure, like he hadn't expected questions from a woman who should know her place. "Ma'am, this is legal business between the railroad and the property owner. Family matters don't concern corporate procedures." "I'm family," Grace said firmly, words that carried more weight than legal documents. "Anything affecting this land affects me and those children sleeping in the back room." "Tomorrow morning at first light," the surveyor repeated, addressing only Silas like Grace had become invisible. "We'll start with the north section, need to mark the proposed right-of-way through your cemetery area and establish proper access routes." Grace felt her blood turn cold as Winter Creek water. They were coming for Margaret's grave, planning to drive survey stakes through sacred ground like it was just another piece of property to be claimed and developed. As the surveyor rode away into darkness that swallowed horse and rider, Grace grabbed Silas's arm with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to stay calm. "Look at the date on those papers," she said, holding the document closer to lamplight. Silas squinted at the official stamps and signatures. "Today's date. How is that possible when Jake said they just started the approval process this week?" Grace felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind, the rushed timeline. The midnight delivery, the surveyor's evasive answers about legal procedures that should take months to complete. "Because they're not following proper legal procedures," she said slowly, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long, dark night. "They're forging ahead without real approval, counting on people being too intimidated or ignorant to challenge them in territorial court. What does that mean for us and our neighbors?" Grace looked at the forged document in Silas's trembling hands, then toward the back room where his daughters slept peacefully, unaware that strangers planned to desecrate their mother's resting place for the sake of railroad profits. "It means we fight them," she said, voice steady as bedrock. "With law, with truth, with everything we have and everyone we can rally to the cause." But even as she spoke those brave words, Grace couldn't shake a terrible certainty that was settling in her chest like winter cold. The railroad crew would arrive at dawn with survey equipment and legal authority, and she had less than 6 hours to find a way to stop them from destroying everything this family held sacred. Grace worked through the night while rain began pattering against windows like nervous fingers tapping glass. Law books spread across the kitchen table like battlefield maps. But the words blurred together as exhaustion weighed her eyelids heavy as lead. Dawn brought no relief, only the sound of boots on the front porch, and another official knock that echoed through the house like nails being driven into a coffin lid. This time, 3 men stood at the door. Not the midnight surveyor, but territorial officials with badges that gleamed like accusations and leather portfolios thick with papers that spelled trouble for honest folk. "Mr. Crawford, Deputy Marshal Thompson, Territorial Court. I have papers requiring your signature before we proceed with legal action." Grace joined Silas in the doorway, noting how his hands trembled like aspen leaves as he accepted the documents. The official letterhead looked authentic enough. Territorial seal, proper signatures, legal formatting that made her heart sink like a stone in deep water. "What am I looking at here?" Silas asked, his voice hollow as an empty grain barrel. "Eminent domain proceedings. Filed yesterday and approved for immediate action. You have 24 hours to respond with acceptance or formal legal challenge. Railroad companies made their final offer $2,000 for the entire north section, including cemetery grounds and mineral rights." $2,000. for land worth 5 times that amount, plus the graves of 3 generations who'd worked this soil with their own hands. "And if we challenge your generous offer?" Grace asked, her words sharp as January wind. The deputy's eyes shifted to her with barely concealed irritation, like she was a dog that had learned to bark when it should stay silent. "Legal proceedings take considerable time, ma'am. Meanwhile, surveying continues under territorial authority. Cemetery remains. Well, they can be relocated at company expense to a proper municipal plot." Grace felt something cold and sick settle in her stomach. They wanted to dig up Margaret's grave, dump her bones somewhere convenient to railroad schedules like she was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to progress. After the officials left, Silas stood in the doorway holding those papers like they were poisonous snakes ready to strike. Grace watched his shoulders curve inward, saw defeat spreading through his posture like infection through healthy tissue. Rain began falling harder, drumming against the tin roof with increasing intensity that spoke of a real storm building on the horizon. "I can't fight them," Silas said finally, his voice cracking like dry kindling. "Not with the girls depending on me to keep them safe." "Silas, no." His laugh carried no humor, just bitter recognition of his own powerlessness. "Look at these papers. Grace. Official seals, federal backing, territorial authority stamping everything legal and proper. I'm just a dirt farmer with a few head of cattle in calloused hands. What chance do I have against that kind of power?" Grace wanted to argue, but doubt gnawed at her confidence like a dog worrying a bone. The documents looked legitimate, the process seemed legal, and the railroad had unlimited resources for extended battles against folks who barely scraped by from year to year. "Maybe we should consider their offer," she began, hating herself for even thinking the words. "Consider what—" Silas's voice rose like wind before a tornado. "Selling out. Letting them dig up Margaret and my parents like they're inconvenient stumps to be cleared for plowing." He walked toward the barn with steps that stumbled over nothing, catching himself against a fence post before continuing like a man learning to use his legs again after a long sickness. In the barn. Silas began mucking stalls with mechanical intensity that spoke of desperation rather than purpose. Pitchforks stabbed into soiled straw, lifted, dumped, stabbed, lifted, dumped. His movements held the desperate rhythm of someone trying to outwork despair that followed him everywhere. Grace grabbed another fork and began helping, working in silence while sweat soaked through their clothes despite the cool, damp air. Rain drummed harder against the barn roof, and thunder rumbled in the distance like artillery fire from some distant battle. Finally, Silas stopped working and leaned on his pitchfork handle like a crutch, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much loss. "I'm going to lose everything," he said, voice barely audible above the rain. "Just like I lost Margaret. Just like I'm failing those girls who trusted me to protect them. You haven't lost anything yet, haven't I?" He gestured toward the house where Mary and Sarah were probably listening to rain against their window, trusting their father to keep them safe. What kind of father lets strangers take his children's mother away from them again? What kind of man gives up without even trying to fight? Grace set down her pitchfork, hearing something break in Silas's voice that cut deeper than any physical wound. "The kind who's been carrying too much weight alone for too long," she said quietly. "I should never have sent for you." Silas's voice dropped to a whisper that barely carried over the rain. "Should have just taken the girls and left when Margaret died. Started over somewhere else instead of dragging you into this mess that's going to destroy everything." The words hit Grace like physical blows, each one finding marks that hurt worse than any bruise. She watched this strong man crumble before her eyes, reduced to self-recrimination and hollow regret that ate at him like acid. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and rain began leaking through gaps in the barn roof, dripping onto straw that would soon turn to mud under their feet. That afternoon brought worse news that fell on them like hammer blows. Jake Henderson rode up through driving rain, his horse lathered and his face carrying defeat written in lines deep as plow furrows. "Emma and I decided to take their offer," he announced without dismounting, rain dripping from his hat brim like tears. "Railroad sweetened the deal, $3,000 for our place if we sign today, plus relocation money for the baby and Emma's medical needs." Grace felt the last support beam crack beneath their resistance. With the Hendersons gone, Silas would face the railroad alone like David facing Goliath, but without divine favor to guide his stones. "Can't say I blame you for protecting your family," Silas said, but his voice carried bitter disappointment that tasted like ashes. "You should consider their offer serious-like," Jake said, rain streaming down his weathered face. "Fighting corporations is rich man's work. People like us, we just try to survive with whatever dignity we can manage." After Jake rode away through rain that turned the yard to mud, Silas disappeared toward the north pasture. Grace found him an hour later, sitting beside Margaret's grave under the oak tree, his pants soaked through from kneeling in muddy earth that clung to his clothes like shame. Rain had turned the cemetery ground to thick mud that sucked at Grace's shoes as she approached. Silas knelt there like a penitent, hands pressed against the wooden cross that bore his wife's name, mud coating his knees and staining his shirt where he'd fallen forward in his grief. "They'll move her to some county plot," he said without looking up, his voice thick with rain and something deeper. "Dump her bones in with strangers and mark the spot with a number instead of a name." 20 years of marriage reduced to an inconvenience for their railroad schedule. Grace knelt beside him in the wet grass, feeling cold mud seep through her dress and chill her skin. The wooden cross bore Margaret's name carved in careful letters that rain was already starting to blur. Margaret Crawford, beloved wife and mother, 1854 to 1879. "She loved this spot," Silas continued, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Used to bring the girls here for picnics on Sunday afternoons. Said when her time came, she wanted to rest where she could still watch over the house and see her children playing in the yard." Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the ground beneath them. The storm was directly overhead now, bringing with it memories of another storm that had taken Margaret's life and left this family shattered. That evening, as wind began rattling windows with increasing fury and lightning split the darkness like cracks in heaven itself, Grace tried to maintain normal routines that felt increasingly hollow. She read stories to girls who sensed trouble in the air, braided their hair with hands that shook, sang lullabies that couldn't quite mask the storm's violence. But Sarah could feel something wrong in the very air they breathed. She clung to Grace during story time, small fingers gripping fabric like anchors in turbulent water that threatened to sweep everything familiar away. "Papa's real sad," Sarah whispered as Grace tucked quilts around her chin, trying to create safety in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything they loved. "He's worried about grown-up problems," Grace said carefully, measuring her words like precious medicine. "Are you going to leave us too?" The question pierced Grace's chest like a knife blade twisted just so. She looked down at Sarah's upturned face, seeing Margaret's eyes wide with the same fear that had haunted this house since the last storm had taken everything away. "Why would you ask such a thing? Because everyone leaves when things get scary. Mama left during the big storm. And now Papa talks about going away too. And his voice sounds like Mama's did before the wind took her." Grace's throat constricted like someone had wrapped rope around her neck. She sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, smoothing damp hair back from the child's forehead while thunder crashed overhead like the sound of worlds ending. Sometimes grown folks have to make difficult choices, Grace said, hating herself for the half-truths and evasions. But leaving you would never be my first choice. But it might be your second choice, or your third. Sarah's voice carried the terrible logic of a 6-year-old who'd already learned that promises could be broken by forces beyond anyone's control. Grace hesitated, trapped between honesty and hope, unable to make promises when their entire world was collapsing around them like houses built on sand. "I promise to fight for you," she said finally. "For all of us, as long as there's breath in my body." "What if fighting isn't enough?" Thunder crashed again, closer this time, and Sarah pressed against Grace like she was trying to burrow inside her skin for safety. Outside, rain lashed against windows with fury that spoke of nature's power to destroy everything humans built and treasured. After the girls finally fell asleep, despite the storm's violence, Grace found Silas in the kitchen, staring at the railroad documents spread across the table like accusations. His clothes were still damp from his vigil in the cemetery, and mud caked his boots where he'd knelt in Margaret's grave dirt. "Look at me," he said, gesturing to his muddy, defeated appearance. "Margaret's husband, reduced to this. Can't protect my land, can't keep my family together, can't even keep my wife's grave safe from strangers who see it as nothing more than an obstacle to their profit." Grace had never seen a man look so thoroughly defeated, so stripped of everything that made him feel worthy of the name. Silas sat there covered in mud and shame, a broken man who'd given up on everything, including himself. "What kind of example am I setting for my girls?" he continued, voice thick with self-loathing. "Teaching them that when powerful folks come calling, honest people just roll over and show their bellies like whipped dogs." Lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark white light, followed immediately by thunder that shook the entire house. The storm was directly above them now, bringing with it echoes of the dust storm that had killed Margaret and started this family's long descent into grief. "I'm taking their money," Silas said suddenly, his voice flat as a dead man's. $2,000 is more than I've ever seen at once. We can take the girls somewhere else. Start over. Maybe California or Oregon Territory, where nobody knows us and our shame." Grace stared at him, seeing a man who'd let defeat hollow him out until nothing remained but bitter acceptance and cowardice disguised as practicality. "You're giving up," she said, words that tasted like poison in her mouth. "I'm being realistic about what one man can do against unlimited power and money." Silas's laugh held no humor, just recognition of his own powerlessness. "Rich folks always get what they want in the end. Poor folks just get to choose how much they suffer before surrendering." "What about the law? The research I've been doing, the neighbors who might stand with us. With what money to fight them? With what lawyers who aren't already bought and paid for? With what chance against federal backing and unlimited resources?" His voice rose with each question until he was almost shouting. "You're dreaming if you think regular folks like us can win against that kind of power." Grace felt her own anger building not at the railroad, but at this man who was throwing away everything without even trying to fight for what mattered most. "So you'll let them dig up your wife and scatter her bones like they don't matter? Let them teach your daughters that family graves are just inconveniences to be moved when rich men snap their fingers? Don't." The word came out like a physical blow. "Don't what? Tell the truth, point out that you're letting fear turn you into exactly the kind of man Margaret wouldn't recognize if she could see you now." The words escaped before Grace could stop them, each one finding its mark like arrows shot by an expert archer. She watched Silas flinch like she'd struck him across the face with her open hand. "Get out," he said quietly, voice deadly calm in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "Silas, get out of my house, pack your things and leave on the morning stage. I never should have brought you into this mess." Grace stared at him, this broken man who preferred surrender to struggle. who would rather abandon everything than risk losing while fighting for what he claimed to love. Rain drummed against windows like bullets, and lightning split the darkness while she gathered the legal documents she'd spent the night studying. In her room, Grace packed her carpet bag with mechanical precision, each folded garment a small defeat. Clean dress, spare undergarments, brush and comb. The few personal items that constituted her entire life, reduced to one small bag and a roll of useless legal papers. As she reached for the door handle, thunder crashed overhead with violence that shook the entire house. Through the sound, she heard something that stopped her cold. Small feet running across pine floors, followed by a child's terrified crying that cut through the storm's noise like a knife through silk. Sarah was calling for her mama, the word torn from her throat by the same blind terror that had preceded Margaret's death in another storm just like this one. And Grace realized with sickening clarity that if she left now, she would be abandoning these children to face their worst nightmare all over again, losing another mother to forces beyond their understanding or control. Grace dropped her carpet bag and rushed toward the sound of Sarah's terrified crying. Through the hallway, she found the child huddled on her bed, small body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, while Mary tried to comfort her with 8-year-old hands that trembled just as badly. "The wind sounds like the day Mama went away," Sarah sobbed, pressing her face against Mary's shoulder. "It's coming to take us too." Lightning split the darkness outside their window, followed immediately by thunder that rattled the house to its foundation. Grace gathered both girls in her arms, feeling their terror seep through her nightgown like ice water. "I'm here," she whispered against their hair that smelled of lavender soap and childhood innocence. "I'm not leaving you. Not tonight. Not ever." Silas appeared in the doorway, his face gray as old ashes. The sight of his daughters clinging to Grace like she was their lifeline seemed to break something inside him that had been holding by a thread. "Grace, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She looked up at him over the girls' heads, her voice steady as bedrock despite the storm raging outside. "These children are my family now, and family doesn't abandon each other when trouble comes calling." She stayed with Mary and Sarah until the storm passed, and dawn light crept through rain-washed windows. Only when both girls had fallen back asleep did Grace return to the kitchen, where she found Silas still sitting at the table, the railroad document spread before him like a death sentence. But now Grace saw something in those papers she'd missed before, a detail that made her pulse race like a thoroughbred heading for the finish line. "Silas," she said, unrolling her legal research beside the railroad documents. "Look at these boundary descriptions again." She spread the surveyor's papers next to the territorial maps, pointing to specific lines with a finger that barely trembled. "The railroad's claiming Section 12, Township 8 North, Range 15 West. But look at this." Grace pulled out the original homestead papers, tracing property lines with careful precision. "Your homestead grant covers Section 13, not Section 12. They're trying to seize the wrong piece of land entirely." Silas leaned forward, studying the documents with growing attention. "What does that mean?" "It means their entire legal claim is fraudulent," Grace said, her voice carrying new strength born of discovery. "Section 12 belongs to the territorial government wasteland with no improvements, no water rights, no cemetery. Section 13 belongs to you under federal homestead protection." "Are you certain about this?" Grace pulled out a magnifying glass from Margaret's sewing basket and examined the boundary descriptions line by line. "Look here. Every one of their official documents describes the wrong section of land. Either they made a massive surveying error, or they're deliberately trying to steal your property by claiming the government owns it." Understanding dawned in Silas's eyes like sunrise after a long, dark night. "So they have no legal right to our land. None whatsoever. And if they proceed with surveys based on fraudulent documents, they're breaking federal law." Grace gathered the papers with hands that moved swift and sure. "I'm writing to the neighbors. if I'm right about this. Every family in the valley has been threatened with illegal seizure. By noon, Grace had visited every homestead within 10 miles. Her horse lathered from hard riding through mud that sucked at hooves like quicksand. At each stop, she spread out maps and legal documents, explaining the boundary errors in plain language that honest folks could understand. Word spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. By evening, 17 families had gathered at the Henderson place, men and women who'd spent sleepless nights worrying about railroad seizures, now learning they'd been threatened with fraud disguised as legal authority. Grace spread her research across Emma's dining table while neighbors crowded around like students hungry for knowledge that might save their homes. Jake Henderson lit extra lamps as darkness fell, casting yellow light over documents that could mean the difference between survival and ruin. "The railroad's been lying to all of us," Grace said, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowded parlor. "They claim territorial approval for land seizures, but no territorial commission has reviewed any eminent domain requests for this valley." She pointed to specific sections of territorial law, reading aloud in language stripped of legal confusion. "Federal eminent domain requires 90-day notice periods, public hearings, and territorial commission approval. None of that has happened here." Tom Mackenzie, who'd already signed away his rights, studied the boundary maps with growing anger that flushed his weathered face red as sunset. "You mean they lied about having legal authority to take our land?" "They lied about everything," Grace confirmed. "Territorial approval, federal backing, survey boundaries, all fraudulent documents designed to intimidate honest folks into surrendering without a fight." "What do we do about it?" asked Bill Morgan, his voice carrying hope for the first time in weeks. Grace pulled out complaint forms she'd copied from territorial law books, official procedures for challenging fraudulent land claims that carried the weight of federal protection. "We file formal complaints with territorial government," she said, passing forms around the room. "We demand public hearings as required by law. We force them to follow proper legal procedures instead of relying on intimidation and false documents." One by one, neighbors added their names to the complaint forms. Jake Henderson signed first, his signature bold and deliberate as a man reclaiming his dignity. Emma added her name beside her husband's with determination that spoke louder than words. Tom Mackenzie crossed out his railroad agreement and signed the complaint with movements that shook the table. "They made me feel like a coward for protecting my family. Now I learned they were thieves all along." By midnight, Grace had 17 signatures and detailed testimony about railroad intimidation tactics that would make territorial officials sit up and take notice. More importantly, she had a community united by knowledge and righteous anger, instead of divided by fear and ignorance. "I'm riding to the territorial capital at first light," she announced to the assembled neighbors, "filing these complaints with the Territorial Commission and federal authorities who have the power to stop this fraud." "What if they refuse to investigate?" Emma asked, bouncing her baby who'd slept peacefully through the evening's revelations. "Then we take it to federal court," Grace replied with conviction that rang like church bells. "But they won't refuse. Territorial officials hate being embarrassed by federal oversight of their procedures." As neighbors departed in hopeful clusters, their voices carrying plans and strategies instead of resignation and defeat, Grace found herself alone with the Hendersons. Baby John slept in his cradle, unaware that his future had just been secured by territorial law and community solidarity. "You saved our homes tonight," Emma said quietly, her words carrying weight that official documents could never match. "We saved our own homes by standing together," Grace replied, rolling up the signed complaints with careful hands. "I just provided the legal framework to make resistance possible." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with autumn air that promised winter's approach, but also spoke of harvest time and preparation for whatever lay ahead. Grace rode toward the territorial capital with signed complaints secured in her saddlebag and determination that could move mountains. At the territorial courthouse, she found officials who listened with growing concern as she laid out evidence of fraud and illegal intimidation. Federal law was clear railroad companies couldn't simply ignore territorial procedures and threaten honest homesteaders with false documents. These boundary descriptions don't match any approved eminent domain proceedings, admitted the territorial clerk, studying Grace's evidence with professional attention. If the railroad is surveying the wrong sections, they're operating without legal authority. Within hours, territorial marshals were dispatched to halt all railroad operations in the valley pending federal investigation. By afternoon, 3 railroad officials had been arrested for document forgery and illegal intimidation of property owners. Grace rode home through sunset that painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, her heart lighter than it had been since arriving at this ranch that had become her true home. The danger was past, the community was united, and the family she'd chosen was safe from corporate greed disguised as legal progress. She found Silas waiting at the gate, his face transformed by relief and something deeper respect for the woman who'd saved everything he held dear through knowledge, courage, and refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. "It's over," she said, dismounting with legs that shook from exhaustion and emotion. Federal marshals stopped the surveys. The railroad's been charged with fraud and ordered to pay restitution to all affected families. Silas stepped forward and took her hands in his work-roughened palms, studying her face like he was seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with gratitude and wonder. "You saved our home, our land, Margaret's grave, everything that matters to us." "We did this," Grace corrected. The whole community standing together when it counted most. That evening, neighbors began arriving with covered dishes and musical instruments, turning the Crawford kitchen into an impromptu celebration of victory earned through legal means rather than violence. Jake Henderson brought his fiddle, and soon the house filled with music that spoke of community bonds stronger than corporate power. As the evening wore on and neighbors shared stories of their fears and their relief, Grace found herself watching Silas play with his daughters, really play with them, for the first time since her arrival. The weight of impending loss had lifted from his shoulders, allowing him to be the father they needed instead of a broken man consumed by grief and helplessness. Later, after the last neighbor had departed with promises to gather again soon for harvest celebrations instead of crisis meetings, Grace and Silas found themselves alone in the quiet kitchen, washing dishes and putting away leftover food that spoke of abundance and community care. "Grace," Silas said as they hung up the last dish towel, "what you did today, organizing neighbors, challenging authority, fighting for truth when everyone else had given up, that took real courage." "It was just territorial law and common sense applied to fraud," she replied, but her cheeks warmed under his steady gaze. "No," he said, turning to face her fully. "It was love. Love for this family, love for this community, love for justice that wouldn't let you walk away when things got difficult." Grace felt something shift between them, not just gratitude or partnership, but recognition of feelings that had been growing quietly beneath the surface of daily life and shared responsibilities. "Margaret would have been proud of you," Silas continued, his words carrying blessing instead of comparison. "She always said that real strength came from standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost." As Grace prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much had changed since her arrival at this ranch. She'd come as a stranger seeking security, but she'd found something far more valuable, a family worth fighting for, and a community that had accepted her as one of their own. The girls were safe, the land was protected, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibilities that had nothing to do with railroad profits and everything to do with love freely given and gratefully received. But as she brushed her hair by lamplight, Grace heard something outside that made her pause. A single rider approaching through the darkness, moving fast but not urgent, familiar in a way that made her pulse quicken with recognition. Through the window, she saw a figure dismounting at their gate, and her breath caught in her throat. Dr. Wilson stood in the moonlight, medical bag in hand and a smile on his weathered face that could mean only one thing. Someone else needed help bringing new life into the world, and they were asking for Grace. Grace pulled on her wrapper and hurried to the front door, where Dr. Wilson waited with his medical bag and the patient smile of a man who'd delivered more babies than he could count. "Evening, Grace. Mrs. Patterson's time has come, and she's asking for you special-like. Says you have gentle hands and a calm way about you." Grace nodded, already thinking of what she'd need. "Give me 2 minutes to dress proper." She threw on her wool dress and gathered clean towels from the linen press, her movements quick and sure. Through the thin walls, she heard Silas stirring, then his feet hitting the floor. "Grace." His voice carried concern, and something else, resignation, that she would always answer when neighbors needed help. "Mrs. Patterson's baby is coming. I'll be back by morning, Lord willing." The birthing took most of the night. Grace held towels, boiled water, and spoke soothing words while Dr. Wilson worked with steady hands that had guided dozens of children safely into the world. When dawn broke clear and cold, a healthy baby girl announced her arrival with lungs strong enough to wake the county. Grace rode home as the sun painted frost-covered fields silver and gold. Smoke rose straight up from the Crawford chimney, and she could smell bacon frying before she reached the yard. Home. The word settled in her chest like a prayer answered. She found Mary and Sarah at the kitchen table, eating biscuits and honey while Silas worked at the stove. All three faces turned toward her when she entered, and the relief in their eyes told her everything she needed to know. "How's Mrs. Patterson?" Mary asked, scooting over to make room on the bench. "Tired but happy. She has a beautiful baby daughter with dark hair and blue eyes that'll probably turn brown like her mama's." Sarah climbed onto Grace's lap without invitation, small hands sticky with honey. "Did it hurt her?" "Some, honey, but bringing new life into the world is worth a little pain." Grace smoothed Sarah's hair, noting how the child no longer flinched from her touch. "Mrs. Patterson said to tell you girls that your Grace has the gentlest hands in 3 counties. Silas set a plate of bacon and eggs before her, steam rising from food that looked like a feast after the long night's work. "Folks are starting to depend on you," he said, pouring coffee that smelled like heaven itself. "I'm glad to help when I can." Over the next weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter, Grace found herself called to neighbors' homes for births, illnesses, and family crises that required a woman's touch. Word had spread through the valley about her steady hands and calm voice, her knowledge of herbs and healing, her ability to organize communities when trouble came calling. But it was the quiet moments at home that filled her heart to overflowing. Mary's embroidery skills improved daily, her stitches growing even and sure. Sarah learned to read simple words, sounding them out with careful concentration. Silas smiled more often, his shoulders straighter without the weight of impending loss. On a crisp November morning, Grace woke to find Silas waiting in the kitchen with coffee, and something that made her pulse quicken. He held a small wooden box in his work-roughened hands, turning it over like it contained something precious. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of a man preparing for important business. "I need to ask you something." Grace set down her coffee cup, giving him her full attention. "When you came here, it was an arrangement, a business agreement for mutual benefit and nothing more." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring that caught morning light. "But what we have now, what we've built together, this isn't business anymore." "No," Grace agreed quietly. "It isn't." Silas took her hands in his, calloused palms warm against her skin. "I want to marry you proper. Not because I need someone to help with the girls or the house. Not because you need a husband for respectability or security." His voice gained strength with each word. "I want to marry you because I love you. Grace Miller. Because you're brave enough to fight railroad companies with nothing but law books and determination. Because my daughters adore you and you've made this house a home again. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you. Grace felt tears threatening not from sadness or relief, but from the simple joy of being truly wanted for herself, not just for the services she could provide. Yes, she said simply. Yes, to all of it. Silas kissed her then, gently, like sealing a promise that would last through whatever trials lay ahead. 2 weeks later, their parlor hosted the Valley's first wedding celebration in over a year. Emma Henderson had spread word through 3 counties, and neighbors arrived bearing gifts and good wishes that filled the house with warmth warmer than any fire. Grace wore a dress of cream-colored silk taffeta that Emma had helped her order from Austin, simple lines with pearl buttons up the back and lace trim at collar and cuffs. Not the elaborate gown she'd dreamed of as a young woman, but perfect for a frontier wedding that celebrated love found in the most unlikely circumstances. Mary and Sarah had spent days preparing their surprise, working in secret with needles and thread, their small faces serious with concentration. As Grace stood beside Silas, waiting for Reverend Mills to begin the ceremony, both girls stepped forward with identical expressions of nervous excitement. "We made you something," Mary announced, producing a square of white cotton fabric that trembled in her hands. Grace accepted their gift with fingers that shook slightly. Embroidered across the handkerchief in careful, uneven stitches were the words "Mama Grace," surrounded by tiny flowers in pink and yellow thread, each stitch a declaration of love freely given. "So you'll remember we chose you too," Sarah said solemnly, her 6-year-old voice carrying weight beyond her years. Grace knelt to eye level with both girls, clutching their handmade gift like the treasure it was. "I will never forget," she whispered, kissing each daughter's forehead. "Not ever." The ceremony proceeded with simple dignity that spoke of frontier values and honest emotions. Reverend Mills spoke about love and commitment and the blessed nature of families formed by choice as well as blood. Jake Henderson and Tom Mackenzie served as witnesses, signing the marriage certificate with careful penmanship that made the union legal in the eyes of man and God. When Silas slipped the simple gold band onto Grace's finger, she felt the last piece of her new life click into place. She was no longer Grace Miller, the spinster schoolteacher from Kansas who'd answered a stranger's advertisement for a wife. She was Grace Crawford, wife and mother and defender of this family she'd fought to protect. The celebration lasted well into the evening. Neighbors shared stories and songs while children played in the gathering dusk that painted the sky in brilliant purples and golds. Jake's fiddle music drifted through open windows, mixing with laughter and conversation that spoke of community bonds stronger than any corporate power. But the most meaningful moment came after the guests departed, and the house settled into peaceful quiet. Grace found adoption papers waiting on the kitchen table, legal documents that would make Mary and Sarah officially hers in the eyes of the law. "Territorial judge approved them yesterday," Silas explained, watching her face for reaction. "If you want to sign them," Grace's hand shook as she dipped the steel-nibbed pen in ink that would change 3 lives forever. Signing her name to those papers felt more momentous than the marriage certificate this was choosing to become these children's legal guardian. Accepting responsibility for their futures with full knowledge of what that meant. Mary Grace Crawford, Sarah Grace Crawford. Their new names looked perfect in careful script that would bind them together for all time. Winter passed in the rhythm of family life shared work, evening stories, Saturday night baths that had become sacred ritual. Grace taught the girls to preserve food for lean times, to embroider flowers that bloomed even when snow covered the ground, to read with voices that brought stories to life. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Grace's herb garden had survived the cold months, sending up green shoots that promised abundance. Mary had grown 3 inches and could read entire chapters without help. Sarah had lost her first tooth and gained confidence that let her venture beyond the yard without clinging to adult hands. On a warm May afternoon, Grace knelt in her expanded vegetable garden behind the kitchen, working soil that had been enriched with compost and care. Mary worked beside her, carefully planting bean seeds in rows straight as fence lines, while Sarah picked wildflowers for the kitchen table. Silas appeared from the barn carrying a wooden crate he'd built for storing root vegetables through the coming winter, planning ahead, like a man who expected to see many seasons in this place he'd chosen to call home. "Looks like we'll have enough vegetables to feed half the county," he said, surveying their progress with satisfaction. "Good thing, considering how often folks drop by for supper," Grace replied. Sitting back on her heels to admire their work, the scene held everything she'd never known she wanted: honest work shared with people she loved, seasons acknowledged and planned for, future stretching ahead bright with possibilities. Margaret's memory lived on in the roses Grace had planted by the front porch, and in family traditions they'd adapted rather than abandoned. As evening light painted the sky in brilliant oranges that promised fair weather tomorrow, Grace gathered her tools while Mary helped Sarah arrange wildflowers in the blue vase that had belonged to Margaret, but now graced their shared table. They walked toward the house together, four people who'd found each other through loss and choice and daily acts of love that built something stronger than any blood tie. Behind them, the garden lay neat and productive, promising food for the table and flowers for the soul. Inside, the kitchen welcomed them with warm yellow lamplight and the scent of bread dough rising for tomorrow's baking. Grace lit the coal oil lamp while Mary set the table, and Sarah arranged her flowers with artistic care that would make any grown woman proud. After supper and evening chores, they gathered as had become their custom, Silas in his chair with agricultural journals that spoke of future crops and improvements, Mary with embroidery that grew daily more skilled, Sarah on the braided rug with Rose the mended doll, and Grace with her latest sewing project that would clothe her family through seasons yet to come. Outside, spring wind whispered through new leaves, and night sounds began their ancient chorus of crickets and owl calls that spoke of life continuing in patterns older than memory. Inside, the coal oil lamp cast dancing shadows on rose-papered walls, while a family shared the peaceful rhythm of evening together. Grace looked around at these people she'd chosen and who'd chosen her in return, not from desperation or convenience, but from love that had grown day by day through shared work and weathered troubles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did on the frontier where survival required constant effort and community support. But they would face whatever came as a family bound not just by law or necessity, but by bonds forged in crisis and strengthened through daily acts of care that made a house into a home. The ranch that had been failing was prosperous again. The family that had been broken was whole. The woman who'd arrived as a stranger seeking security had found something far more precious, a place where she belonged completely, loved and needed and valued for exactly who she was. As Grace banked the fire for the night and checked that doors were latched secure, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the winding path that had brought her to this place, to these people, to this life that was everything she'd never dared hope for. The future stretched ahead like an open road, bright with promise and rich with love that would endure through whatever storms might come. Home at last. I need to tell you something about Grace's story that weighs heavy on my heart. When I first heard about this mail-order bride who stood up to railroad companies, I thought it was just another frontier tale. But as I dug deeper, I realized it wasn't really about one woman's courage. It was about what happens when neighbors choose to stand together instead of standing alone. Grace didn't defeat the railroad with legal knowledge alone. She won because 17 families signed those complaint forms, because Jake brought his fiddle to celebrate victory, because folks realized their neighbor's fight was their fight too. That's why Grace's story matters beyond one Texas ranch in 1879. This story is a work inspired by frontier tales created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters and events are products of imagination, and any resemblance to real people or situations is purely coincidental.